they told me. Son, you're special. You were born to do great things. You know what? They were right.
As Gregory Clays signifies in his book, the word dystopia evokes disturbing images. We recall ancient myths of the flood, that universal inundation by divine wrath, and of the apocalypse of Judgment Day. We see landscapes defined by ruin, death and destruction. We see swollen corpses, derelict buildings, submerged monuments, decaying cities, wastelands, the rubble of collapsed civilizations. We see cataclysm, war, lawlessness, disorder, pain and suffering. From this simple enough description, we can understand the ideals and atmosphere of a dystopia. Whilst utopia represents the dream world, dystopia represents mankind's nightmare world. But sometimes both these worlds can become linked and merged. And for this essay, I want to look at a dystopia-utopia world with lots of intriguing elements to it. The video game franchise BioShock and the two worlds it introduced gamers to. The underwater metropolis of Rapture and the floating city in the sky, Columbia. The first point of what makes BioShock's universe so interesting in terms of understanding utopias and dystopias is the cities of Rapture and Columbia. Both share similarities and differences in all manners. Rapture is the underwater setting for both BioShock and BioShock 2. Both games present Rapture in the 1960s, 8 years apart roughly. What's interesting is how much Rapture borrows from classic 20th century literature from the likes of Orwell and Huxley for its inspiration. This is best explained by Robert Jackson, who explains, BioShock should be understood in the tradition of reading dystopian literature as reflections of the cultural zeitgeist. Thus, Rapture reflects the player's complicity of partaking in modernist grand narratives, such as technological progress, capitalism, and the individual, which are revealed to be manipulations within a dystopia of modernity gone wrong. From Jackson's point, we get a good understanding of the point that the dystopian city of Rapture aims to create in the player. The game is very similar to the dystopian science fiction writings made by the authors such as Huxley and Orwell in the mid-part of the 20th century, which is specifically the time frame in which Rapture's events are primarily set. Furthermore, in BioShock Infinite is the floating city of Columbia. Whilst completely different in terms of era, mood, tone and lighting, the city of Columbia presents another intriguing aspect of dystopia. The idea of a supposed utopia being completely false to brainwashed masses. Jackson further discusses this idea as he argues, if Rapture aimed to protect its ideals through surveillance and deregulated industry, Columbia takes the next step in defending its religious ideals, by stamping on anything that isn't white and American. It brandishes as much conservative propaganda as Rapture, but instead of directing it towards laissez-faire freedom and crass advertising, Columbia aims it towards segregation, purity, and vigilance. As Jackson's argument suggests, whilst Rapture's propaganda-based machine of painting the city as a utopia to its residents, as is Columbia with creating it as a literal heaven in the sky for its elitist people, ultimately both cities fall short of these untrue promises made in their propaganda. So from Jackson's point about propaganda, we can therefore understand the political power that individuals create to brainwash people. In the case for the BioShock games, the series feature individuals with incredibly high influential power to make the denizens of these fallen cities be easily manipulated at their command. Which brings me to my next point in the creation of the dystopias of BioShock. The individuals that run and govern both Rapture and Columbia. This is expressed by Adam Rosner, who infers, each powerful figure in the BioShock storylines has their own political viewpoint and corresponding political tie. The games show different forms of government which are all flawed, illustrating that achieving a literal utopia is ultimately impossible, and dystopia is created instead. The games take a cynical approach to utopian ideas by exposing their inner rotten cores. A fascinating aspect of BioShock is the corrupt leaders that the player must confront within each game. BioShock features two, Andrew Ryan, based on a firm right-wing capitalist leader, and Frank Fontaine, a lower-class crook who essentially rises to the power of an oppressive dictator. BioShock 2 presents us with Sophia Lamb, who, unlike either Ryan or Fontaine, displays a much more left-wing socialist approach to running Rapture. Finally, in BioShock Infinite is Zachary Comstock, who, very differently to the previous leaders, runs a more theocratic fascist regime in Colombia through religion and race beliefs of perfection. Each leader has a different standing point on the political table. Each has different priorities in running their city. Ultimately, the biggest trait they all share commonly is the inevitable factor that their systems are flawed, and eventually, as each game progresses, their society ends horribly.
Ask him what happened to your
Ryan and Fontaine are both brutally murdered,
Let go of me.
whilst Lamb and Comstock's family-oriented beliefs are crumbled right before them. So ultimately, whilst these characters believe in what they are doing is creating a new utopia for their city, ultimately the flaws outweigh the benefits and the cities literally descend into chaos and madness. The systems fail the people, and this causes war, fury, famine, death, and all manner of social-based issues. From discussing the fall of flawed systems, I want to bring this issue that the games could discuss about the contemporary society in which all three games were made in the time of. Richard Sherry states, BioShock achieves the heights of philosophical and social critique that made classic dystopian fiction, such as Orwell's 1984, so successful, and in the same way manages to transcend time to feel just as relevant today as when it came out almost a decade ago. From Sherry's argument about BioShock still being a relevant game to today's modern society, we need to look at the modern world today. The world is raging with larger-than-life leaders who promise the masses great amounts. Media industries send out dozens of false newsletters and storylines every day to the masses. War rages all over the world, and there is a constant trouble within international unions. The inner systems of today are gradually in decline and falling apart. But the higher political powers try to show a blind eye to this, just as the leaders of Rapture and Columbia all did. High powers in denial of the real-world issues around them is an incredibly relevant point that the BioShock series have made that still to this day resonates with gamers and also everyday people. So to conclude, overall, the BioShock series is an incredibly rich and detailed game series with an amazing underbelly of political, social and religious commentary that still today resonates with all kinds of people in modern society. With a fantasy-made world in the heavenly skies or a dark, scary underwater metropolis. Nonetheless, these worlds and their inhabitants are still as recognisable to people today just as they were in the days of Orwell. They haven't dated and they never will date, because human nature doesn't learn from itself.